Biden being like a relatively a safe older white guy in 2020 helped him then. But now it's seen as something that's very negative, and I'm just sort of, so this is where I sort of struggle. Thank you for joining us, and welcome to a new episode of Power and Flower. John Hagner and I are a political scientist and a political consultant who are trying to understand and explain what is going on in U.S. politics in 2024. We also care deeply about pastries. Today, we are going to be talking about Joe Biden's popularity or lack thereof. And there's actually a lot of different aspects of this that we want to get into. But I want to start this off by throwing John a question here. Joe Biden is at, but the latest averages, 538 averages of all the polls show him at about a 38% approval rating. And that's pretty similar to where he is in terms of, like, look at matchups with Donald Trump, right around 38, 40%. And I guess I just want to ask you, like, what should his approval rating be? Like, is this normal? Is this what we should expect? Should it be higher? Should it be lower? In I guess a normal world, what would it look like?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. If we were talking 20 or 30 years ago, I would say that his approval rating should be in the high 50s, that objectively things in the country are going pretty well. We have low unemployment rates, wages are going up. Obviously, there's inflation problems, but wages have mostly been keeping track. We see really strong Democratic performance in down ballot races. Most of the things that we would have looked at 20 or 30 years ago to try to help us understand this would say that Biden should be doing pretty well. But I think that we're in a new world. I think we're in a world where we should expect presidents and leaders of all kinds in all countries to be disliked by most of the population. I think there's a lot of reasons for this. And I think one factor of this is partisan polarization, which has gotten a lot deeper in America in the last decades. But there's a large number of people who, no matter what Joe Biden did or said, would never approve of his performance. The same is true in reverse, right? There's a large number of people that there's nothing that Donald Trump ever could have done that would have made people say that he was doing a good job. These folks are much more locked in than they ever have been. But I think what's really going to be interesting is trying to see what this persistent low approval rating has to do with vote. We know that going into the 2020 election, the most important voters were the ones who didn't like either Donald Trump or Joe Biden. And we know in 2020 that group of people voted pretty overwhelmingly for Biden, and that's why he won. And I think, going forward, figuring out how many people in the country dislike both Biden and Trump and what they do is going to be the big key to understand what happens. What do you think about that question, Seth? What do you think that his approval rating should be?
I mean, I'm really kind of struck by it. And I would agree, like somewhere I would think I don't like to think of it as like we're not in the normal world and we used to be. But yeah, like political science has, devoted a fair amount of effort to understanding what causes presidents to be popular or unpopular. It's usually, going back to, throughout the era of public opinion, going back to like the 1940s, generally when the economy is doing better, when unemployment is low and growth is decent, we tend to see more popular presidents. When we're not in war, we tend to see more popular presidents. And so, yeah, I would think, somewhere in the 50s would seem pretty normal considering where things are. And it is notable that, like, we saw a similar pattern to this, like when Barack Obama was president. He briefly was popular coming into office. He had approval ratings in the high 60s. But then by the time of his second year in office, he was like down in the 40s, and it never really got up much above that until like he was on his way out the door. Trump had an approval rating in the low 40s most of his time in office. Biden got into office. He had an approval rating in the mid 50s, which was, fairly high for the current era for much of his first year. And then he does the Afghanistan withdrawal. His approval ratings take an immediate hit, drop like 10 to 15 points. And he's been stuck close to 40 ever since then. And like you could sort of understand, okay, yeah, he got some bad press for Afghanistan, but that's nearly three years ago now. The economy's moved up and down, but he has not seen any benefit from it. It's actually like it's kind of striking how how really kind of stable and low these numbers are.
Yeah. Do you have a theory for why the Afghanistan withdrawal seems to have been such an important moment in Biden's approval rating?
So, one of the things we know, like you say, we live in a very polarized environment. Typically, Democrats will be exposed to news that will cast Biden in a relatively favorable light. Republicans will be exposed to news that cast Biden in a horrible light. So, that just sort of confirms what people see. The coverage after Afghanistan was almost uniformly negative. A lot of different people all across the spectrum had a lot of negative things to say about it. And that was the signal that most voters got, that Biden had made a mistake one way or the other. And so, yeah, it cost him, it didn't hurt him much among Republicans because they already hated him, but it hurt him among independents. It hurt him among some Democrats. But that negative press all across the board only lasted for a few weeks, and his numbers still remain low in the wake of that.
I've heard some people theorize that the press was bad, but the fundamental promise of the Biden campaign in 2020, what he told to those sort of double hater voters who didn't particularly care for him but didn't particularly care for Trump, was that he was going to bring things back to normal, that it was sort of a promise of competence, of adult leadership, and that the chaos that we saw in Afghanistan was undermined that basic theory, which I think there may be a point to. I think the other thing that's really notable is that once the Afghanistan withdrawal happened, we also saw a spike in gas prices, and I think so much of what we see in presidential approval rating, it, you talk about when you would expect political scientists understanding the relationship between the economy and approval ratings. I think from my perspective as a political operative who's not as worried about the theory but is worried about sort of the day-to-day practice, most people don't know what the GDP is, but they know what gas prices are. And a lot of the time,
right,
the real human beings understanding the economy comes down to three things, right? It's what they are paying at the grocery store, what shows up in their paycheck, and what they see on the gas price sign every time they go by. I think Afghanistan was the beginning of it. From the political science literature so well. What parts of the economy do you think are the most important part when people are coming up with their opinions about politics?
There's a debate in political science on this. There's actually there's a number of studies that show that regardless of what people say about the economy, their votes actually more closely track GDP, or it tracks another statistic the government uses, real disposable income, which is just kind of a measure of how much spending money people have from year to year. And when people have more money in their pockets, they will reward the party that's in power in the White House. And that, even more important than vibes is like what goes on in real life. That might not always be true. So 1992 was this interesting year, and probably an interesting parallel to this one, where there had been a pretty deep recession in 1991. President George H.W. Bush at the time was pretty unpopular because of that recession. But 1992 started, the economy was growing again. Unemployment was high, but was coming back down. And he just sort of figures, well, thank goodness this recovery is here. But people didn't believe it. And Bill Clinton was very good at sort of exploiting people's concerns, their ongoing concerns about the economy. A lot of the media reported the economy as very down, even when it was recovering. And that may have really hurt, an incumbent's reelection chances that year. And so it's not always clear to me, when people sort of go with what they feel, or when people sort of go with whether they actually have a job or not, or spending money or not.
One interesting thing that you brought up was the way that the media reported on the economy in 1992. And I know that that's something that a lot of Democrats have had a whole lot to say about this year is that, the media forecast a recession and kind of beat that drum for a long time. And when no recession appeared, a lot of people were very slow to change their tune on that. And that, yeah, there's been some interesting polling that's come out that shows, we're at 40-year lows in the unemployment rate, but half of the electorate doesn't know that or thinks that the unemployment rate is very high. Like, what impact do you think the way that we talk about the economy has versus the way the economy actually is?
Again, my impression has long been that people react more to the amount of money in their pocket than what they're being told in the news. Um, but at the same time, if you're told every day on a news station you watch that we're in a recession or about to be in a recession and that everything is terrible all the time, that's probably not going to have zero effect, right? That's got to change your outlook somewhat. And it just gives people a sense that no one knows what they're doing. This place is falling apart. And if you're just sort of generally down on stuff, people blame the incumbent. That's just pretty typical normal behavior. So I think there's some of that, but also we've been talking. I don't know that that's that new, right? We've been, people rarely talk positively about the economy in the news. And I don't think that has changed a whole lot since the 90s or the early 2000s. People are rarely wildly enthusiastic saying, hey, we're in a boom. No one ever really reports that at the moment. And yet, presidents' approval ratings used to vary more.
Yeah.
And they just kind of don't so much now.
People love to talk about media bias, but I think the only true media bias is to negativity, right? That I think it's bad news will always get covered more. No one has ever said, great news, every plane landed today, and the weather was sunny.
One thing that surprised me, and this is just sort of getting back to the Afghanistan question here, is that Biden seems to get zero credit for literally having ended a war, right? I mean, that was, it was a low-grade war, but it was one of these forever wars that people just assumed we will just be stuck in this war forever. We were in it for 20 years. And it's been unpopular for a long time. Particularly younger, more liberal voters were complaining about it and saying, this was unacceptable. It's one thing that more progressive voters always really resented about Barack Obama, is that he supported this ongoing drone war. And Biden just sort of ends it by fiat one day. And not only did he not see any credit for it, he took a real hit for it.
Yeah.
It really hurt his popularity. And today, young voters consider him a warmonger because of Gaza. He has gotten no credit for ending a war, and he gets a lot of penalty for starting a war that he didn't start. I'm not sure how to think about it. It seems like there's this weird, the incentive system there is really messed up, right? if you can, if there's credit for starting a short-term war, but there's no credit for ending one, that's a kind of a perverse set of incentives there.
Yeah, it's a terrible set of incentives. And, I think Trump understood that the politics of Afghanistan weren't going well. He was making efforts to withdraw. I think it's probably likely that had he been reelected in 2020, that the withdrawal timeline probably would have been about the same. But now Trump is benefiting politically from not being in office when it ended, which I think is, a real irony given that it was the plan down the war in Afghanistan started in the Trump administration. Yeah, I think
Right.
there's a real problem for progressives that people on the left are inherently dissatisfied. And if a Republican political consultant were on this call with us, I'm sure that he or she would be saying the same thing about people on the right. That partisans, by definition, demand a lot and they want a lot. And it's very much a "what have you done for me lately" kind of a group of people, where something happening in 2001 feels like a really long time ago. And when even at the time, I think, folks who wanted the war to end didn't like the way that it was ending, right? That the scenes of chaos, the people being left at the interpreters and translators and civilians being left at the airport, even folks who agreed that it was time for that war to end were unhappy with it happened, how it happened. But now looking back on it, there's been so many things that have happened in the world since then. The full-scale war in Ukraine, what's happening in Gaza, that I think that just feels like a really long time ago.
Yeah. And also, like, I'm to get into the sort of sense of, like, grumpiness of liberals here. In many ways, what has been kind of surprising is that, like, I feel like Biden has delivered far more for the left than the left had any right to expect. But Biden got nominated back in 2020 for one simple reason, and that is that Democrats thought he could beat Trump. Like, they were willing to, look the other way on a lot of other things, but simply thought that he could win. But Biden, made a real point of, like, reaching out to the Bernie Sanders people and, like, coming up with some sort of agreed agenda with progressives, and actually did a fair number of these things. Like, the Inflation Reduction Act included a lot of investments in climate change mitigation, impact on the use of solar, on electric vehicles, on electric battery storage. The economic growth that we've seen has been heavily concentrated among the poorer parts of the population. He's forgiven huge amounts in student loans, something like $170 billion in student loans, last numbers I saw. And yet progressives don't seem to like him at all. Like, they were wary of him in 2020, but willing to work with him. Now they're still wary of him, and they seem to have turned against him. And I'm really sort of curious, like, what's your take on that? Like, why do you think delivering on policy might not be the key to popularity, or maybe he just hasn't delivered on enough policy? I'm curious what you think about this.
Yeah, like I think that there's a ton there, and there's a lot that we can unpack. I would start from the place of saying, I agree that I think Biden has been a really effective president for progressives, particularly given the thin margins that we've had in Congress, right? That we saw how poorly Mike Johnson handled a small majority, and before him, Kevin McCarthy. But that was a small majority. In the first 2 years of the Biden administration, the Senate margin has been incredibly thin, and built on folks like Joe Manchin who have very different political motivations than Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders. So, given the challenges in this, I think the Biden administration has been incredibly successful. But I think there's a few things there, right? Like the first is that, you know, my experiences in political work, having been a political consultant for more than 20 years, worked on a lot of campaigns, is that, there are very rarely contests of who better aligns with the policy vision of the majority of the people. The policies are important, but there's a lot of other things, vibes, personalities, messaging, storytelling that go into it. And I think that, Biden is an old white man who's been around for a really long time, and whose career, his persona is built on compromise, backstopping, let's get stuff done kind of politics that does feel like a real throwback. A lot of what progressive voters are looking for is tone and style as much as it is policy. And Biden has never been a good vessel for the sort of tone and style that a lot of people are looking for. So I think that's one part. I think another part, and this is going to make me sound a little bit like a conspiracy theorist, but if you look at the media that are being consumed by most progressives, right? Younger people, more progressive people, are much more likely to be getting their news from social media, getting their news from sort of a fractured array of news sources. And a lot of those, let's be honest, have an ideological agenda, right? TikTok is one of the main news sources being used by younger voters, and it is controlled by a foreign state actor, right? That a lot of what sets the tone for political coverage is Twitter, even though, a lot of people don't read Twitter themselves, but the people who make the news are relying on Twitter, and that's controlled by people with a really clear ideological agenda. So I think that's a part of it. I don't want to overstate the impact of that. I think another part of it is there's a real conflict for the White House and the Biden campaign in how you message about these successes, right? That in order to win as a Democrat, you need progressives to be excited and turn out, and you need a lot of moderates to vote for you. And those messaging streams sometimes are the same, right? Sometimes you want to tell the same story to both those kinds of voters, but sometimes you don't, right? I mentioned a lot of what progressives are looking for is about tone and is about style. Those things that excite progressive voters turn off a lot of centrists and turn off a lot of moderates. I have long advocated that the most effective way to be a Democratic elected official is to accomplish big things in progressive policy and to talk about them like they're boring and centrist. That's
Mm-hmm.
often the sweet spot. I think Biden's trying to do some of that, but running into the problems of making everybody happy at the same time. And I do think the last piece of this, and it's a really big piece, is that the war in Gaza is really difficult problem, right? Like there are no good political solutions for the Biden administration here. There's no good political solutions for anyone, right? There's a reason why Israel and Palestine have been, such a difficult situation for folks to sort out for so long, right? That if Biden had a button he could push that said "end the war," I have no doubt he would push it. But that button doesn't exist, and there's nothing that he can do that's going to make a lot of people happy. And there's a lot that he can do that makes everyone unhappy. I marveled day after Trump was convicted. Biden went and made a speech about the Middle East, which, why would you go from the best news you've had in months to talking about the one thing that is guaranteed to make important people mad? But
Yeah.
that's what needed to happen.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. I think Biden was already having a fair number of these problems with the left prior to the war in Gaza, but I think this is pretty substantially made it harder on him. He is, it's interesting because if you look at polling on the Israel-Gaza war specifically, there's obviously a huge age gap there, right? The older voters tend to be much more sympathetic to Israel. Younger voters tend to be much more sympathetic to Palestinians. But that really divides the Democratic Party.
Yeah.
Where Biden is presiding over a coalition where, a big chunk of the party leans toward Israel, and a big chunk of the party, the younger voters and people and voters of color, lean much more toward Palestine. And, really his best hope is just to make the issue go away,
right.
Which is not something he has the power to do anything about. But whichever direction he moves, he alienates more of his party.
Well, you're exactly right. That Biden benefits when this is not in the news, right? That there are so many issues that are great for Biden, right? We have abortion, we've got the improving economy, we have Inflation Reduction Act. There's a lot of things that are good arguments, but there's no way that a focus on the war in the Middle East is going to help Joe Biden at all. I do think that there are some things that they can do, and I'm sure that they will do as we move toward the election about, making sure that people understand that you may not be thrilled with the Biden administration, but here's what Trump would do, right? And Trump has been quite clear that what he would do would not make the people on the left who are unhappy about the war happy. I think that there are things that they can try to do to refocus the election as a choice and not a referendum. But in general, any minute spent talking about this is a bad minute for Joe Biden.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think that's right. And there was something you touched on in there too that that is probably more important than I've given it credit, and that he is an old white man, right? And this is something that, his age is something we've danced around this issue a little bit. That is something that is sort of on and off again, a big topic in U.S. politics. And if you talk to young voters, I talk to some of my students, and they really seem to resent that he's old.
Yeah.
And I do not fully get that. I must admit, do they just hate old people in general? Because they all seem to like Bernie Sanders, who is a year older. Donald Trump does not seem to have this problem, even though he's roughly the same age. He's unpopular, but for other reasons. And it also seemed like Biden being like a safe older white guy in 2020 helped him then. That was, Democrats saw that as this won't alienate people, but now it's seen as something that's very negative. And I'm just sort of, so this is where I sort of struggle. And I want to ask you this, like, a lot of my impression is that, almost any Democratic president would be in a pretty similar place right now. Like if Kamala Harris were president, or Gavin Newsom, or Pete Buttigieg or something, they would also have these same sort of people's feelings about the economy, or a lingering hangover from COVID, or Gaza, or anything else would be making them similarly unpopular. Or do you think that's wrong? Do you think a lot of that has to do with Biden's own identity and it just not being a match for where his party is today?
I think that one of the problems with doing politics, I'm sure you know this even more, right, as a political scientist, is we don't have the counterfactual, right? Like we can't change one experimental condition and see what's
right.
going on. It would be nice, but a couple points I want to make. I think first, it's not true that younger voters can't get down with old people, right? You mentioned exactly. I was going to bring up Bernie Sanders is older than Joe Biden, can pack an audience of young people, both when he was running for president, but also still now, right? Like, I don't think that it's a foregone conclusion that any older politician will struggle, but Biden obviously does. I think some of it is, he is well known to have a stutter and is a little bit more cautious, which I think comes across to some people as being a little bit diminished. I think that's real, and we can't ignore it. That I hear all the time, when people know that I work in politics, it's fairly common that people, so is he really a vegetable? Does he just sit there and get told what to do? And, the Wall Street Journal will happily interview anyone who says yes to that. And everyone I know who has spent time with him says, no, he's smart, he's in command, but he stutters and he struggles sometimes to put words together. And I think that is a real hard challenge. I think that it's interesting you mentioned the 2020 election, where eventually people decided that him being an older white man meant that he was safe, but that happened pretty late, right? It's easy to forget how badly he was doing for most of 2020, right? That, everybody had a chance to be the leader in that race except for Joe Biden, it felt like, right? That, there was the Elizabeth Warren boomlet, there was the Pete Buttigieg boomlet, Kamala Harris seemed like she was on the rise for a while. Really, when people decided that Biden's age was an attribute was after COVID hit, right? First, the African-American voters in South Carolina said, we know this guy, we trust this guy. And then at about the same time, COVID became really real. And I think that Democratic voters across the board said, we don't know what's going on. We need sort of a flight to safety. And those things combined to say, let's go with the safest option. But that's not where the party had been a year before. And I think we may just be past that moment now where, folks felt like that was a real attribute. I think that from a messaging and campaign perspective, there's no way that the Biden campaign is going to convince people that Joe Biden is not old, right? That is not on the table.
Right.
What we can do is try to fight this to a draw. And, they've got, luckily, Donald Trump to run against, who is 3 years younger and, makes long, rambling speeches about shark attacks in Nevada, announces that the city where the Republican convention is being held is terrible. Right? Like, if you're looking for sort of senior moments, Trump has 100 of them a day. And I think that it gives the Biden campaign some material to work with. But yeah, I think there's no way that they can take age off the table. They just have to try to fight it out to a draw.
I'm going to disagree with you a little bit on what you said about Biden's nomination, but we don't have to litigate that today. But but I just, he was a poll leader for most of 2019, not by a ton, but like, he had like, it was in like the 30s when when all the other candidates were like fighting for like 15 to 20%. But he was always like just doing good enough. Like he never had a good debate or a particularly great speech or anything like that. But almost nothing was ever catastrophic for his campaign. And there were enough people enough people who usually like make endorsements, enough prominent officials who were sort of leaning Biden's way throughout that year. But and I think that mostly happened before COVID really became a thing. But by that time, then it was just down to him and Bernie.
I mean, he came in fifth in Iowa, which for most campaigns
would be,
would be the end of it.
No, that would be bad. There was one point I wanted to bring up with you is just like we had talked a little bit about like sort of where Biden's popularity should be. And one of the things we were talking about earlier is just like his popularity compared to other world leaders. Like where does he fall there?
Well, I think this is a great point, right? Like right now you look across the sort of industrial world, like use the G7 leaders as an example. Biden is more popular than most of them. We're looking, they've called a snap election in the UK. They've called a snap election in France. Both of those countries, their leaders are really struggling. And Rishi Sunak's problem is not that he is too old, right?
Definitely not.
Emmanuel Macron's problem is not that he's too old. I think it's really interesting. We've got leaders on the center left, leaders on the center right. The leaders in Germany and in Canada and in Japan are all radically underwater. They're unpopular by sort of 30 or 40 points. The only leader in the industrial world who's more popular than Joe Biden right now is the Prime Minister of Italy, Giorgia Meloni. But everywhere else, I think we're going to have elections in most of the European elections just happened in June, and incumbent parties did poorly across the board, and more extreme parties gained. We're going to see, it looks like in the UK, the Conservatives are going to get absolutely shellacked in their election in July. It's hard to know what's going to happen in France. Justin Trudeau is currently on track to lose to Conservatives in Canada. We're really in a moment where being in charge means that you are unpopular. And that crosses age, ideology, everything else. I think, there are a few things that all these leaders have in common. Right, like inflation is obviously a problem everywhere in the world as the global economy has come out of the COVID slump. I think the other place, though, that all of these leaders are facing, and something that is important for us to put in context here, is that all of those leaders are facing a much more fragmented media environment than we are used to, right? And I think the political science models that you understand so well and that have informed a lot of the ways that we think about how elections should work assume a population with a shared set of facts, right? That we assume that people know how things are going, know what's happening, know what the candidates stand for, where they're coming from, that we have kind of a shared understanding of reality. And that gets less and less true every day, right? That, liberals love to complain about Fox News and love to talk about its influx, but on a normal day, Fox News has less than 1% of the registered voters in America watching it. And that's a very popular station. And if there are 1% of folks to tune in on a nightly basis, the rest of the media environment, whether it be partisan media, whether it be centrist, we're just fracturing and we don't all have the same things we can agree on. And that's true in the US and it's true around the world. And I think it gives all of these leaders a real struggle in how they communicate their message, how they get the word out about what's happening, but also how, changing policies or, as we were talking about earlier, having an improving economy. If people don't know that the economy is improving, or if they can't agree on what an improved economy would look like, the impact that has is reduced. But yeah, I think it's entirely plausible to say the question isn't why is Joe Biden so unpopular, but why is he so much more popular than he should be given how everybody else is in the world. I don't know that helps feel better about what the polling looks like if you're the Biden campaign, but it's still very true.
That's really interesting, and that might reflect in some ways, that the U.S. may have actually dealt with the post-COVID environments in a somewhat better way. That the Biden administration is focused more on spending and preventing massive unemployment and actually getting inflation under control somewhat better than other countries have. But yeah, like if we think about, it's because he seems old and out of touch. And not hip. Well, that's not Justin Trudeau's problem, right? He still looks like a hot 25-year-old, but like he's He's deeply unpopular. His party's going to lose. Rishi Sunak, his party's about to lose. There's a lot of this going on. Okay. So this is actually really, I think, a helpful way to think about it. I think we're nearing the end of our discussion here, but one thing we like to do, if you're okay with it at this point, is to we want to conclude each episode with a pastry tip. That is, try to take advantage of both our interest and experience in baking and cake decorating and everything else. I don't know if you had a particular topic you wanted to bring up today, John.
Well, I want to ask you about cake decorating. You mentioned that.
Okay.
For folks who are tuning in and just joining us, one of the ways that Seth and I connected is that we both care about politics, but we also care a lot about carbs. I spend a lot of time thinking about baking, but I'm a terrible cake decorator. I just don't have the skills for it. And I know that that's something that you really excel at. What tools do you use for decorating cakes that I should invest in?
Well, that's an excellent question. So the thing that I do a lot of freehand work, and that's just something that works well for me. It's something I enjoy doing. I make a lot of buttercream frosting, which is actually really easy to make and not terribly messy. That's just made with powdered sugar and butter for the most part. And I get a bunch of Wilton pastry bags, and I have a choice of Wilton tips. Usually I work with a pretty fine tip, like a number 2 or 3. And I just I draw a lot of stuff freehand. I'm pretty good at that. My father was an eye surgeon. I inherited some of his microsurgery skills and just apply them to pastries. So that helps. But something that's, other things that are good for decorating. Some people really like to work with and work well with fondant, which if you've played with that at all, fondant has gotten actually really, it's improved a lot over the years. You can buy it at most, at grocery stores or hobby stores. And it rolls out fairly easily to make like a nice one-colored shape that you can cut into whatever shape you want on a cake. You can use a couple of different colors and make some really nice patterns. And it used to taste horrible, and it doesn't taste horrible anymore.
You can make a cake look good, but do you want to eat it if it's covered in fondant?
You know what? Maybe. And if I don't, just peel the fondant off and eat what's underneath. So that, I think that works pretty well for people. I've never really gotten into some of the other stuff like, airbrushes or anything like that. But there's a fair amount of fun you can have just doing freehand stuff. Is that good?
Good.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you all very much for joining us today. And please stay tuned for the next exciting episode of Power and Flour. We will talk to you soon. Stay safe.
All right. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much for listening to Power and Flour. This episode was produced by Eli Maskett. We will be recording throughout this election season up until the November election.